In Russia, it is a dangerous profession to oppose the government in general and Vladimir Putin in particular. Let's have a look at some of the Russians who died under suspicious circumstances in the past 14 years. In 2004, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, a critic of Vladimir Putin, was poisoned, and evidence that could prove it was destroyed. She survived writing an article about the experience, but she was gunned down in the elevator of her Moscow apartment 2 years later. A month after that, former agent Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London by a radioactive substance in his tea. Litvinenko became a critic of the Russian government after leaving the KGB, which is the successor, or the KGB's successor, the FSB. In one of the most outrageous deaths, Oleg Zhukovsky was killed in 2007. The senior executive at the Russian bank VTB allegedly committed suicide by putting a bag over his head, tying himself to a chair, and throwing himself into his swimming pool. Zhukovsky opposed the Kremlin takeover of the bank he worked at. In 2009, human rights lawyer Stanislav Markelov and Anastasia Babarova were killed in Moscow, shot in broad daylight. Markelov is believed to have been the main target. He represented journalists who were critical of Putin and brought cases against members of the Russian military, among others, for human rights abuses. Human rights activist Natalia Estemirova was kidnapped in 2009, then shot on the side of the road. She was a frequent associate of two of the activists who I mentioned earlier. And then there's the Russian tax lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was arrested and died in custody in 2009. Severe beatings and mistreatment allegations are blamed for his death. Magnitsky allegedly found tax officials and police officers were bilking citizens out of millions of dollars. Authorities dropped the investigation into his death, but his name lives on in the U.S. Magnitsky Act, which severely sanctions nearly 4 Russian officials and businessmen with connections to Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a top Putin critic and political rival, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down within sight of the Kremlin in early 2015. Nemtsov was once seen as a successor to Boris Yeltsin, later documenting corruption and abuse of power in the Russian government.
Okay, joining us now, the Atlantic Council's Dan Fried. All right, Dan, Ali just went through the list, and that did not include attempted killings. There's some political figures, but there is a long list of businessmen. Now, obviously, none have been directly traced back to Vladimir Putin. You know, similar to mob bosses, you can't often get to the top. But why do so many Russians critical of Vladimir Putin seem to end up dead? And a parallel you could draw, loads of companies here don't do business, especially money managers in Russia, because they simply don't trust their safety and the rule of law.
I think the reason why is pretty clear. Putin's system is a system based on fear, and it is fear designed to silence people so he can get on with his business of looting the country and providing wealth for his immediate associates. Putinism is a kleptocracy. It relies on keeping democracy on the defensive and weak if he can do it, on intimidating his neighbors, and spiced up with the occasional murder. This is the person we have to deal with.
Fox News' Chris Wallace spoke to Vladimir Putin yesterday and asked him about this. Let's listen.
Why is it that so many of the people that oppose Vladimir Putin end up dead or close to it?
Well, first of all of us have plenty of political rivals. I'm pretty sure President Trump has plenty of political rivals.
But they don't end up dead.
Not always. Well, haven't presidents been killed in the United States? Have you forgotten about it? Well, has Kennedy been killed in Russia or in the United States? Or Mr. King? What happens at the clashes between police and civil society and several ethnic groups? Well, that's something that happens on the U.S. soil. All of us have our own set of domestic problems.
Wow, that's interesting. He's comparing alleged state-sponsored killings of rivals with the deaths of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King or civil unrest. But these are uniquely different things.
Well, this is standard Soviet communist debating tactics. It's no surprise for those of us old enough to remember the way Moscow used to behave. This is typical, and there's no reason to follow Putin down his rabbit hole of denial and lies. We know what Putin is. The Russians who are aware know what Putin is, and we need to base our policies accordingly and stop romanticizing the man or trying to rub up against him, for God's sakes.
Okay, well, we say that we know who Russian President Vladimir Putin is, but the question is, does the president, putting him on the same platform, on the same playing field, when the leader of Russia is not just not our ally, he's not even our competitor. If you think about what a weak, feeble nation they are compared to the United States, especially from an economic perspective. But I want to talk about how President Trump emulates Putin, especially when it comes to the press. Give us perspective on what effect it has on the United States when the president continues to call out legitimate news organizations as fake news, when the free press is something we're founded on.
You've touched on a much larger problem. The United States has been the leader of the free world, and that is a world we built to advance our interests and our values at the same time. That's America's grand strategy, and it's been fabulously successful for our country. President Trump doesn't seem to be committed to it at all, neither to our values nor the way we've organized democracies to combat first communism and now to make the world a better place generally. President Trump seems to regard America's democratic institutions at home with the same contempt he regards the institutions of the free world abroad. He seems interested in the philosophy might makes right and a kind of nationalism. That's bad for our country, and I think we need to take this seriously and stand up to it on those terms. We need to stand up. Americans need to stand up, and Republicans in Congress in particular need to stand up in defense of American values and America's grand strategy.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.